Putin News Now. Experts say Putin faces a new threat at home while Russia's military exposes itself overseas. Over the weekend, mercenaries from the Wagner Group staged a brief rebellion against the government of Russia. A direct challenge to Putin, the revolt was contained before it could reach Moscow. It comes at a time when Russia's armed forces are preoccupied with the Ukraine conflict and less able to respond to other crises. The Saturday morning march on Moscow led by Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner Group mercenaries quickly fizzled out, but the failed uprising has renewed concerns about Russian President Vladimir Putin's stability in office. These inquiries arise as the Ukrainian military prepares to launch an offensive against the Russian military, which has been restocking its forces in Ukraine with outdated hardware and inexperienced troops since the latter half of last year. Experts say that while these efforts have strengthened Russian units in Ukraine, they have made the Russian military less resilient overall and reduced its ability to respond to other crises. Losses are concentrated among Russia's best soldiers and highest quality equipment, and while there is little official information about Russian casualties in Ukraine, most estimates place them at tens of thousands of troops killed and thousands of armored vehicles, artillery pieces, and aircraft destroyed. At a Georgetown University event in April, Dara Massakat, an expert on the Russian military from the RAND Corporation think tank, stated, "The Russian army that started the war in 2022, it's basically not there anymore. Moscow has called up hundreds of thousands of reservists and deployed Cold War-era hardware that has been sitting in storage for decades. While millions of Russians are still potentially recruitable, the loss of experienced troops is seen as particularly damaging to Russia's military effectiveness, as pointed out by Massakat and others. Since last year's summer, I've been following along as they bring them out of Siberia. A point is reached where there is not a lot of usable equipment," Massakat said. To put it another way, I haven't seen any evidence that there is this great lurking powerful Russian army fist that is sitting somewhere east of the Ural Mountains, the author says. Russia has been trying to show it still has some muscle, especially with its relatively undamaged air and naval forces. Russia's Pacific Fleet conducted a major short-notice exercise in the middle of April, and one of its newest guided missile frigates sailed through the Atlantic and into the Indian Ocean this year for training with friendly navies. The powerful Russian Northern Fleet has also held significant drills this year. Russia's naval activity in the North Sea, Norway said in May, is at its highest since before the pandemic. The Russian armed forces have been reducing their overseas posts as they rush to deploy ground troops to the conflict in Ukraine. Massakat stated at the April event that experienced contract troops stationed in occupied regions of Georgia and Central Asia have long since been deployed to Ukraine. Russia's actions have left it extremely vulnerable on a global scale. Aside from Syria, Central Asia, and occupied parts of Georgia, it doesn't do much international business, but the bases it does have are in danger, as Massakat pointed out. The Russian military's ability to respond to crises like the political unrest in Kazakhstan in January 2022, when paratroopers were dispatched from Moscow to support President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, who is still in power, was weakened by heavy losses among Special Operations Forces, especially VDV airborne troops. Expert on Russian military affairs Mark Galeotti said in an interview that if a similar event occurred today, he would be very surprised if Russia could mobilize the same forces. Galeotti elaborated, saying that the force was essentially a peacekeeping unit, but that it was really questionable if they could do anything, and everyone knows that, because it relied on the paratroopers who are doing so much of the heavy lifting in Ukraine. Concerns are also raised about other parts of Russia's immediate neighborhood where the Russian military has been used to impose Moscow's will or to support allies. Is Georgia prepared for a crisis? Russia's military might have significantly dwindled in the region. What will they do if there's a major problem in Armenia or Tajikistan? Massakat declared back in April. They are not equipped to handle a serious crisis if it occurred in one of those areas. Their recent willingness to ignore Russia is an indication of their uncertainty. Because basically he doesn't fear the Russians anymore, Galeotti told Insider, Tokayev has become an increasingly outspoken critic of Putin. It's really striking how neighbor countries, which for so long had felt they had to tiptoe around Moscow, are clearly no longer afraid, Galeotti said, adding, I think Russia will be in a much less capable position to defend. The weekend's uprising, which followed months of vitriol from Prigozhin aimed primarily at Russia's military leadership, is seen as the most serious challenge to Putin since he rose to power in the late 1990s, though its ultimate consequences remain unclear. Putin's demise has been predicted for quite some time. Angela Stent, director of Georgetown University's Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, said as much at a Sunday event hosted by the Brookings Institution. While Putin may face challenges in the future, Stent warned that his regime may not collapse very soon, and that it may not be immediately obvious what is happening if and when it does. Stent said, I, like any person who has been a student of Russia throughout his or her professional life, know that things are stable in Russia until they aren't, and you could wake up tomorrow and something completely different can happen. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby, when asked on Monday if Putin was in a weaker position, said the United States was focused on Ukraine and that the events in Russia over the weekend were an internal Russian matter. Kirby emphasized the fact that the bulk of that military is across the border in Ukraine, where it is defending itself from Ukrainian attacks. Mr. Putin still commands a very large and very capable military, he said.